Great. On behalf of the NASA Citizen Science Leaders Series and the Citizen Science Association, welcome to today's event. We're so glad that you're with us. My name is Sarah Kirn. I'm from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and my full-time role is supporting the NASA Citizen Science Program with Marc Kuchner, NASA's Citizen Science Officer. Marc and I, along with Jennifer Shirk and Reanna Putnam from the Citizen Science Association and Heather Fisher, have been producing events like this one since 2020. So please know that we are recording today's event to share on our series website. Please make sure that you're muted when other people are speaking. If you're having any trouble hearing speakers or you just want to, you can turn on the closed captions. They're not perfect, but they're really helpful. You can look for that little CC icon at the bottom of your screen. You can also control what you can see. You can slide the line between faces and slides to get more of what you'd like to see. You're in control of that. During today's event, both the chat and the Q&A tool are open. We encourage you to put your questions for the speakers in the question and answer tool, that Q&A tool. You can find a link down at the bottom of your screen. Note that you can also upvote other people's questions or make comments on them. We will be pulling questions from there for our question period discussion at the end of today's event. You can also post questions anonymously if you like. Just look for that little box that you can check that you'd like that makes your question anonymous. Today's event is being co-hosted with the Citizen Science Association. So here with me now is Reanna Putnam, Program Manager of the Citizen Science Association, to tell you a little bit about what they do and their upcoming conference.
Great, thanks, Sarah. CSA is a member-driven and practice-focused association that connects people to exchange ideas, questions, and inspiration in support of effective public research partnerships. Research and monitoring that is done by, for, and with members of the public can be found in almost all disciplines, traditions, and contexts, and requires leadership that reflects the many different areas of expertise. CSA's membership strives to welcome, engage, and reflect the many perspectives needed to make this work possible. Next slide. One of our flagship programs is our biennial conference that we've been hosting for 10 years now. We get to gather again in person in Tempe, Arizona this coming May for the first time since 2019, and we look forward to seeing many of you there. Our C-Science conferences are the only US-based conference where you can access the ideas and inspiration from the many perspectives needed for these public research partnerships to thrive. The preliminary program includes sessions that will address global collaborations, local library partnerships, data feedback loops, strategies for scientific success, and much, much more. Registration opens next week, and we hope you can join us. Next slide. CSA has been a partner on this NASA Citizen Science Leader Series since way back in the beginning in 2020. We're excited today to share the series event with many from the CSA community and beyond, and welcome you to check out the archives of past recordings and resources for more quality content created through this series. While some of the content is geared towards NASA project leaders, other webinars and events offer tips and insights relevant to all projects. I'll turn it back over to our series host, Sarah Kirn, to tell us more about today's event and get that started.
Great, thank you, Reanna. I am so excited about today's event. We are so lucky to have the panelists with us today that we have representing their respective federal agencies. We have 6. We have a lot to cover and very little time to do so. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, and then she will introduce the next, and on down the line until we get to our discussion. So Alison Parker is not a federal program officer, but she is the Senior Program Associate in the Science and Technology Innovation Program of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She came to the Wilson Center from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where she led initiatives to increase the use of crowdsourcing and citizen science in EPA research and decision-making. She was a close observer of and a participant in the creation of the Federal Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act. We've invited her here to kick off today's event with her perspectives on the short formal history of citizen science in the federal government. Thanks, Alison.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for the invitation to participate. As Sarah mentioned, I'm just going to kick us off today with a very brief sort of history and overview of how the federal government engages in citizen science and related approaches. My perspective, of course, right now, Sarah already mentioned, I'm joining you today from the Wilson Center, but also a few years in my past as a fellow at the Environmental Protection Agency, where I was an observer and participant in a lot of this work. So I'm planning to give an overview of the many ways that federal agencies use and deploy and adopt and strategically position citizen science and related approaches in the interest of agency missions. So we'll think about sort of funding, implementation, et cetera, et cetera. I'll touch on some examples from the agencies that will come later, but hopefully you'll see more details as we run through their presentations. So everything that I mentioned will just be a bit of a teaser. I'm hoping the other presenters will sort of build on what I'm saying and correct me if I say anything that isn't correct. I'll also mention quickly that I'll use the phrase citizen science, but of course we know well that there is a range of ways that people use to describe this and related work, including the way that agencies have chosen to represent the work that they do in this space. So again, it will be great to hear from each individual agency about how they're describing work going on towards their missions. So I decided to set up this part of the talk just to run through all the various ways that federal agencies engage, some of many. And quickly through the next slide, I'm going to actually skip over fund because I think that will be the focus of the rest of today's presentations from the rest of the panelists, and jump right to implement, because that I see as the other major way that federal agencies engage with crowdsourcing and citizen science, which is generally sort of the pairing that I'm used to talking about from a federal government perspective. So, and here's where I'll get into some of the history that I think is most relevant. We know that prior to 2011, early in the 2000s, there was a lot going on related to citizen science, and with many federal employees engaged in various efforts, including funding organizations like NSF, which we'll hear from later. But there wasn't a ton of coordination or guidance from higher levels of government. And through a series of events, eventually some of these federal employees formalized into a federal community of practice for crowdsourcing and citizen science, many members who are here today as panelists. And so just as a few points of interest in the past 10 years, this community of practice worked with the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Obama administration, and also worked with the General Services Administration, GSA, on a set of resources for federal staff, which includes a catalog of projects that had federal involvement and a toolkit sort of guiding use by federal staff for creating citizen science and crowdsourcing projects. And those resources can be found at citizenscience.gov. And that was sort of a major event in those, what I think of as early days in federal government work with citizen science. Alongside these activities, John Holdren, which was Obama's science advisor, he issued a memo that was called Addressing Societal and Scientific Challenges Through Citizen Science and Crowdsourcing in 2015. This was a big deal for us, and there were a lot of sort of outcomes of that, but especially that each agency identified a coordinator, and it also established some core principles, and some of that carried forward into the Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act, which many of you are aware of, which was passed in early 2017. And this provided some clarification on legal issues and essentially was important as a piece of sort of authorization for the use of citizen science and crowdsourcing in federal agencies. And I'll mention that most of these initiatives were really focused on the use of crowdsourcing and citizen science by federal agencies, so helping federal staff implement projects. I'll run through quickly some other ways that federal agencies engage in crowdsourcing and citizen science through, if you go to the next slide, for example, sorry, skip that one, thank you. Guiding work in citizen science in, broader environments, including CSA and other sort of practitioner groups. Some of the big examples of this that I'm aware of are work coming out of EPA, such as this citizen science handbook on quality assurance and documentation, as well as things like work with air sensors and other tools that citizen science and community science groups might be using, and providing some helpful tips about things like data management and other issues that come alongside citizen science and crowdsourcing. And then finally, I'll quickly mention that agencies have also worked internally and also with stakeholder groups to come up with citizen science strategies. And I think these are a great way to get a sense of sort of agency culture and how citizen science is thought about in each of these agencies, sort of beyond what you might hear today from each of our representatives. And these have gone a long way to sort of direct how agencies have a sort of unique approach to citizen science and crowdsourcing. So I'll leave it there and skip the next slide and introduce our next speaker, who will get into specific agency work. So we'll hear from NOAA next. John McLaughlin, go right ahead and introduce yourself. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Alison. I'm an education program manager with the Office of Education at NOAA, and I have a pleasure to serve as a co-coordinator for our citizen science efforts, along with my colleague Laura Ormland from the Fisheries Office of Science Technology. On to our next slide. If you are not familiar with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, our mission is to understand and predict changes in climate, weather, ocean, and coasts, to share that knowledge and information with others, and to conserve and manage coastal and marine ecosystems and resources. Next slide, please. I want to start with some notes on the use of terminology with regard to the efforts we'll be talking about. I would note that these efforts go by many names, both within and external to NOAA, and these are all valid. Today, I will be using the term citizen science as the main terminology, but do not in any way mean that these are open to only citizens of a given nation. So on to the next slide, please. Within our agency, this work has a long history. We have often involved volunteers in the scientific process with at least one project, our Cooperative Observer Program, dating back to the 1800s. In the past 15 years, technologies such as smartphones and online projects have majorly expanded the ways people can engage and communicate. On to the next slide, please. We see growth from this change in our tracking of data on projects active within our agency. We know these projects engage over 500,000 volunteers per year who contribute over 1.1 million volunteer hours each year that we are thankful for. 73% of these projects have started in the past decade. And we do have over 60 projects currently listed in the catalog on citizenscience.gov. And we have noticed record participation for a lot of these projects in the past few years. And we've actually noticed most of these projects have continued to grow through the pandemic, which we are glad to see. And I just note that just about every project we have reports being run in partnership, including some being run through grants. So thank you all. Many of you here on the call today, I know are partners in our project. So we would not be able to do any of this without you. On to the next slide, please. As these type of efforts expand, so has our understanding of their potential impacts and best practices. And they have multiple outcomes. These outcomes are not exclusionary, but rather they can be complementary. Coming from the field of education, I have particular interest in how they impact learning. If you do as well, the Learning Through Citizen Science report from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is a great resource for learning how to intentionally design for such impacts. And on to the next slide, please. So these impacts and outcomes that I've spoken to, along with great potential for continued growth and development, led to citizen science being named one of 6 science and technology focus areas for NOAA in 2020. In 2021, we released the NOAA Citizen Science Strategy to outline a path for how we engage the public in support of key mission areas. And on to the next slide, please. There are 5 goals within this strategy. The first is to coordinate and support ongoing efforts across our agency. Second is to expand integration of citizen science into agency operations. The third is to promote data quality and accessibility. We want any citizen science projects that involve NOAA to have resulting data that represent NOAA's high standards and uphold our agency's reputation as an objective, trusted source of information. We also want to strengthen partnerships, which, as I mentioned, are core to all of our projects. And grants are a major way in which we support some of these partnerships. And finally, we have a goal to increase the proficiency of staff within our agency to run thoughtful, well-designed citizen science projects. On to the next slide, please. Some things we have upcoming is we plan to release an action plan, which will detail the steps we are going to take to accomplish our strategy. Should be coming out in April. We've also been working on an agency-wide information collection request to help ensure compliance of our projects with the Paperwork Reduction Act. We're developing metrics to go along with our outcomes, and we are looking to increase prize capacity within our agency. And one thing I'm excited about is we will be highlighting some volunteers within our projects for Citizen Science Month this coming April. So stay tuned for that. On to the next slide, please. So now grant funding. In short, our agency does a lot of its work through grants. Last year, our agency supported over 2,500 financial assistance transactions, which include grants and cooperative agreements, for a total of $2.8 billion. So there are a lot of opportunities out there. Citizen science may not necessarily be called out or may not be the core focus of many opportunities, but citizen science can be a project, it can be a component of projects supported through opportunities across our agency, including through our cooperative institutes and our affiliate networks such as Sea Grant. A few projects of note: the Small Business Innovation Research Program, or SBIR, has called out citizen science the last few competitions as an area of interest and funded citizen science projects, and these are all linked in my presentation. There are some regional fisheries cooperative research opportunities that include citizen science. The Salt and Stall Kennedy, aka the SNK grant competition, has funded and called out citizen science. And in the education world, our environmental literacy and Bay watershed education and training programs have called out citizen science and supported citizen science programs. And on to the next slide. Because I'm a program officer for the environmental literacy program, known by an acronym, as so much of our work in NOAA is ELP, I do want to call out the use of citizen science here. And this program has a theory of change to communicate the philosophy guiding the program. And this theory of change calls out that key learning approach used by multiple of our funded projects is citizen science, and that citizen science can be especially well suited to advance goals of justice. Next slide. If you want to find our funding opportunities, the main site is grants.gov, and I have a link here to finding the specific opportunities from our agency. And you can also find a listing of opportunities from our affiliate Sea Grant network at a link provided here. Final slide. Some considerations when you're writing a proposal: make sure you're responding to what's requested. Use a logical layout. Reviewers are going to want to know the logic behind your project. And consider that the reviewer may have no previous knowledge of your program. So use plain language and proofread. And with that said, I have the pleasure of turning things over to a colleague I have been able to work with, McCallie, a program director at the National Science Foundation.
Thank you, John. I want everybody to notice your Coco Ross precipitation gauge. I have one in my backyard. I got 0.04 inches yesterday. Thank you, John. And it's fun to follow NOAA because NOAA both runs citizen science projects and funds citizen science projects. And the National Science Foundation, we don't run any projects. And so I'm going to talk about what has come in to the National Science Foundation as proposals that have gone through a merit review process and were funded. In other words, we can't fund what comes in. So as I talk about things, it's basically going to be exciting projects that the field, i.e. the nation, the US, has put into the National Science Foundation we've been able to fund. Next slide, please. Next slide. And per John's comments, I'll be using the terms public participation in scientific research, citizen science, and crowdsourcing interchangeably. So the National Science Foundation, basically, what we do is we fund. We fund research. We don't fund just cool stuff. We fund cool stuff and knowledge building. It has to have discovery as a part of it. We fund about approximately 25. We support basically universities and colleges, as well as community groups, museums, nonprofits, media companies, etc. So please don't count yourself out of who can apply to the National Science Foundation. We receive about 55,000 proposals each year. They go through a peer review merit process, and we fund about 12,000. Next slide. All right, so I'm showing you the structure here of the National Science Foundation because this is going to help you find solicitations or calls for proposals that you can apply to. You'll see that we have directorates like computer and information sciences, education, engineering, etc. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a incomplete overview of PPSR and citizen science and crowdsourcing at the National Science Foundation. How come it is incomplete? It's because we don't tell you what to apply for, and we don't have a program that says apply for public participation in scientific research. Instead, we find that the approach of PPSR CCS is valid, useful, and really empowering discovery and learning in so many different areas. And so instead of saying you need to fit here, we say field, you know best on where you can leverage PPSR CCS to best lead discovery and learning. So some general areas. Basically, what's in it for science and scientists, what's in it for participants, and the art and science of doing the work. So as many of you know, citizen science work doesn't just happen. There is an art and science to it. And we fund not just the scientific discoveries, not just how to encourage and work with people, but also what makes citizen science and crowdsourcing PPSR work well. So we fund all of that. Next slide, please. All right, so this is to give you scale. I just did a quick search on nsf.gov. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Currently, there are 531 active awards that have some kind of PPSR citizen science in them. If you look at a breakdown, you'll see that bio has 186, computer science has 104, education has 42, engineering 38, et cetera, et cetera. So the point is, going back to, there's not one window or door. I mean, the floodgates are open. How does it make sense for you to get into the National Science Foundation to use this approach for discovery and learning? Next slide. Okay, and I'm going to show you how to do that, but first, let me give you some examples. The different directors have different programs, so what they fund is different. For example, computer science, often data quality, a lot of human-computer interface work, the development of platforms, and AI. Education, human resources, which just changed its name to STEM education, so I need to change this. We fund a lot of how do people learn through PPSR? What is the art and science to make it go? To make citizen science the high quality, high learning? That's often where you find it. The director of biology and geology, it's actually the geosciences. It's really often collection of data over large geographic or temporal scales. And in biospecies identification and in the geosciences, it's and in bio, it's a lot of georeference data. Next slide. Continuing on in social behavior economic sciences, how to engage people. Data authenticity, quality, engineering, developing and adapting tools, mathematics and physical science, again, computer learning algorithms, and the Office of the Director of Policy and Decision Making. You'll see that there's a lot of overlap here. In other words, I'm going to show you now, next slide, on how to start looking for where you can start looking for two things. One, what is NSF already funded? And number two, where might you apply? And so this is just a slide that you can go back to. It's NSF award search. It's the advanced search feature. And you'll notice that there's a keyword search. So you put in citizen science, and then you want to see active awards. You'll notice that highlighted in yellow, I have element code and also the NSF organization. I'm going to come back to those in a bit, but you see that if you search here, now go to the next slide if you would. You'll end up with a list. And if you click on the list, you will see individual awards. And you'll see who got the award, how much the award was for. And the important part is you see the NSF organization. So this is the Division of Research and Learning. So if you happen to see a lot of awards like the kind of thing you want to do, similar, in this division, then if you'll go back to the previous slide, you would put it in the NSF organization. So you want to look there. And then the program element code, I'm going to show you how to find that as well. That also is associated with each award. So next slide. Actually, you can't, one back. Well, this will do. Great. Yeah. So here, you know, if you download, if you click one by one, you see the individual information about each particular award. If you download the list, you'll see, let's say that you liked everything that was coming up in this ASIL, Advancing Informal STEM Learning. Yes, that's the program I work on. You'll notice that that program element code is 7259. So you can go back and you can search for all the awards that ASIL has funded recently. And that'll give you a sense. The reason I suggest this, it gives you a sense. If you put just citizen science in, it gives you 500 and something, and you can see the range of what NSF funds. If you put in a specific code, you'll have a better sense of what individual programs focus on, and then you can expand that out and decide where to apply. So next slide, please. So what are the commonalities across NSF funded projects? Discovery, advancing discovery, advancing methods and approaches to make discoveries, broadening participation. We focus on the missing millions. Who could be doing science, technology, engineering, and math? How do we meet societal needs, opportunities, and challenges? And going back, we don't fund cool stuff or successful projects just because they're cool or successful. We are about innovation and discovery. And at this point, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Heather Drumm at EPA.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, my name is Heather Drumm. I'm EPA's Participatory Science Coordinator, among other things. And I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about the funding landscape for participatory science at EPA. I did want to note that last year, EPA made the move to change our terminology from citizen science to participatory science. And although it's more difficult to say, I stumble over it all the time. It's become part of the fabric of our program as we move toward making this approach as broad and inclusive as possible. EPA uses participatory science as sort of an umbrella term to capture both activities originating in academic and government institutions, as well as those that are community-led projects. Next slide. I wanted to start off with a quick overview of the funding situation for participatory science at EPA. Unfortunately, we don't have a dedicated funding mechanism, but instead we use a variety of extramural and intramural programs to fund participatory science projects. By and large, the most popular way to fund our projects is through our grant programs. We use grants and other extramural mechanisms to fund projects and provide resources to external organizations to give them the ability to start their own projects. Less often, but still as important to our portfolio, we develop and support our own projects using internal funds. But I think regardless of how the projects are funded, EPA has a history of partnering with states, tribes, schools, local governments, NGOs, and community groups to engage the public in the field of environmental science. Next slide. I wanted to take this opportunity just to point out a few of our grant programs that have historically provided funds to some of our participatory science work. This is typically, so most of our funding most of our participatory science activities are conducted by external organizations with our funding. This is typically done through our grants program. We have an extensive grant program that awards over $4 billion a year. These 4 bullets that you see on this slide are typically used to fund some of our participatory science work. The first 2 bullets that you see are grants from our environmental justice program, or what we call our EJ program, that help to serve, that help underserved and overburdened communities across the country. Actually, EPA recently announced $100 million for environmental justice grants, which is the largest that the agency has ever been able to offer. The Environmental Justice Small Grants Program is designed to help communities understand and address exposure to multiple environmental harms and risks. This grant program is definitely one of the more popular for funding community-based projects. All projects must be associated with at least one qualified environmental statute in order to qualify. Another one that I wanted to point out is the Collaborative Problem-Solving Cooperative Agreement Program, which is another tongue twister, that provides financial assistance to eligible organizations and assists recipients in building partnerships with other stakeholders in their communities to develop solutions to environmental or public health problems. This one's actually open right now. I believe it closes at the end of next month. We also have specific grant programs that are focused on air and water. I did put an example up on the slide that in 2021, EPA's air program announced the Enhanced Air Quality Monitoring for Communities grant program to support community efforts to monitor air quality and promote partnerships with tribes, states, and local governments. The program used money from the American Rescue Plan to award over $53 million to 132 air monitoring projects across 37 states. We also award competitive environmental education grants that often include a participatory science component. These projects provide participants with real-world experiences collecting scientific data. Next slide. I think we missed one. Yes, that one. EPA also funds research grants, which we call the Science to Achieve Results, or STAR program. STAR supports funding for research by leaders in their fields across the country. These grants are awarded in environmental priority areas for the EPA that include air, ecosystems, climate change, safer chemicals, sustainability, and water. These research grants are used to a lesser extent to fund what we would technically define as participatory science. But I've included an example here of a recent project where 6 research organizations were awarded a grant to develop low-cost air pollution sensors. They then collaborated with their local communities to help the community members use the sensors to understand the air quality in their neighborhood and their personal exposure to the pollutants, which then empowered the communities to take action to protect their health. Next slide. To a lesser extent, but just as important for us, many staff have initiated participatory science projects using intramural funding. Projects are often aligned with our own internal strategic action plans and can be funded through various programs throughout the agency. I did want to call out one of these. It's a program out of my office, the Office of Research and Development. We like acronyms just as much as everybody else. We call it the ROAR program. It stands for the Regional ORD Applied Research. For many years now, this program has provided limited funding dedicated to providing opportunities for EPA researchers and staff in our regional offices to collaborate with states, tribes, and local governments on environmental issues that affect their communities. Next slide. I wanted to thank Alison for the shout out on some of the resources that EPA has been working on over the last few years. I did want to call out some of those and let you all know that they are linked from EPA's participatory science homepage. We're really proud of the story map. It's an interactive visual representation of some of EPA's participatory science projects, both those that are funded through grants and those that are initiated by EPA staff. There are 5 maps on the story map that focus on projects related to environmental justice, water quality, air quality, STEM education, state and tribal partners. In many instances, we indicate which grant programs funded a particular project, which might be helpful for folks. I believe Alison also mentioned our new vision and principles document. It was released June of last year. It describes EPA's vision for the strategic use of participatory science approaches in EPA's work. It highlights principles and best practices and includes an implementation plan. And many of you may already be aware of our quality assurance toolkit. It is designed for use by organizations who are starting a project. It includes a handbook, a template, and also a video series called Make Your Data Count. Several EPA regional offices operate small equipment loan programs for measuring air and water pollution. You can find out more about those programs on our website as well. These programs provide training and technical support to help groups properly use the equipment. And finally, EPA is also beginning to establish technical assistance centers across the nation that will be coordinated through our EJ program and will serve communities with environmental justice concerns. And that's the end of my presentation. So I will pass it over to Marc Kuchner from NASA.
Diggity. Hi, Heather. Yeah, we should tag up about sometime about air quality projects. If anybody wants to send me an email and be part of that conversation, I'm putting my email in the chat. Thanks. Next slide, Sarah. Thank you all for being on this call and for representing the hard work that you and your agencies have been doing to support this kind of science, which we know goes by many names. NASA, yes, our website calls it citizen science, and we have caveats though to point out that it has no limitations on whether or not you're a citizen of any country in particular. So previous slide, if you don't mind. Oh, okay, I see they're in a different order than I pictured. Okay, next slide. So NASA's citizen science projects have come to dominate multiple scientific fields. They've discovered most of the known comets. There's no qualifier on that. It's just most of the known comets. All of the known samples of interstellar material. There was an entire issue of meteoritics and planetary science dedicated to investigations of those dust grains. Most of the ultra cool brown dwarfs, and a third of Kepler's long period exoplanets. Next slide. We've also discovered, I have new lyrics to this song. So I usually sing the right side of this plot. So those of you who have been following my singing career will appreciate the new lyrics here. So we have 11,581 candidate near-Earth asteroids, 1,213 solar jets, 900 yellow ball star-forming regions, 144 imposter planets, 34 companions to ultra-cool dwarfs, 32 eclipsing binaries, some large-scale traveling ionospheric disturbances, and one active asteroid named 2015 FW412. Hold your applause, folks. That's right. Next slide. These discoveries come from 32 projects that are open to the public as of now. 20 of these projects can be done by anyone, anywhere, with just a laptop or cell phone. You can find those on our website, science.nasa.gov/citizenscience. Look for the projects with the little icon that looks like a gingerbread man. Oh, thanks, everybody. I'm available for parties. So our take on citizen science at NASA is maybe different from elsewhere. We stare hard at that word science, and we declare that our citizen science projects are projects that are held to the same rigorous standards as any NASA science project. So these are merely excellent science projects that rely on volunteers. We sort of use the word. We like to use the word volunteers when we, especially just when we describe these projects to the public. Next slide. 410 of our volunteers have become named co-authors on refereed published papers. And we list all those on our website to celebrate them. That's refereed published scientific papers. This is hardcore stuff, and we're super proud of it. Sarah Kirn has been working our way, interviewing all of those citizen scientists who have co-authored papers and learning more about them and celebrating them in profiles, which you can also find on our website. Next slide. We've realized that real-time interactions between citizen scientists and scientists change people's lives, not just the lives of the volunteers, but it also has this way of transforming the behavior of scientists. It's just addictive to work with volunteers and amateurs. Once professionals get a whiff of the brain power and the dedication that our volunteers have, they don't want to turn back. So it's catching on. More and more of our projects are starting to hold these regular meetings or video cons or even phone calls with volunteers. 12 of them already hold these regular events. So it adds an extra layer of depth to these interactions. Next slide. These are just some more of the awesome headlines that have come out in the last year. Next slide. So it's a great time to build citizen science project. And this is partly because of the awesome comms people that we have that promote the work of our NASA citizen science projects at the @Do NASA Science channels on Twitter and Facebook, and Scramble each week. Poor Kim Holloway struggles to interpret the latest output of all of our citizen science projects and translate it into something that's public friendly to tweet about every week. We have also a partnership with Zooniverse. I see some Zooniverse folks online, and we're proud to be enabling that wonderful platform to continue supporting projects. About a third of our NASA projects are hosted on Zooniverse. And Zooniverse, as you know, has this wonderful graphic user interface where it makes it super easy for people to launch projects, and that's free. Of course, there are workshops like this. Next slide. So on to how we fund citizen science. We have one longstanding dedicated citizen science call in Earth Science, and then we have two new citizen science specific calls, our seed funding program and our heliophysics citizen science investigations program for longer term funding. Plus, you can use citizen science as a research method when you apply for any program element whatsoever in NASA. Anything that you apply, any grant proposal you write to NASA can include citizen science as a research methodology. And there is in fact extra funding throughout NASA's research opportunities and space and earth sciences program to encourage those projects. The seed funding call has supported so far about 20 new launches of citizen science projects, and that call is open every year. Next slide. We're also opening up new incentives for people who want to propose new NASA missions. So if you want to PI a new NASA mission, you have an idea for a probe, there are incentives in some of our upcoming calls. Next slide. Oh, actually, let's go back to the previous one because there's a cool picture in there. By the way, see that picture is a picture of the Crab Nebula. And right going through the letter P, there's this kind of weird gash in the photo. That's an asteroid that was discovered by a citizen scientist on the Hubble Space Telescope asteroids project. And the citizen scientist also made that cool image as well. Anyway, Hubble data was used in more than 6 different science projects and reached about 250,000 volunteers. And now we have 2 citizen scientists who have won as co-Is time on the James Webb Space Telescope. Next slide. I need to mention although we have that strict definition of citizen science as being science, we also have some other really cool programs that are adjacent to citizen science and can support citizen science and have supported citizen science. And if you come to our March 16th workshop, you'll hear Lynn Chambers and I forgot who's going to speak about the environmental justice program, but you'll also hear about our new environmental justice program, which is in its second year. Next slide. This is NASA's year of open science. That includes citizen science. So we're working to transform all different NASA science projects into efforts that share their data, share their code, share their publications. And we're looking forward to that as an underpinning of future citizen science projects. Next slide. And starting in the fall, and I'm almost done, Sophia, is the heliophysics big year at NASA. So between the October eclipse and the upcoming April eclipse and the solar maximum, there's going to be some fantastic opportunities for citizen science and a whole slew of new projects that are coming online centered around eclipse science. And I'm sure you'll hear more about that from me coming up. Next slide. And I think my last slide. Almost. So upcoming events, we're going to have a CitSciCon series of events for the public. The first one's in April for Citizen Science Month. We'll have first in-person gathering of our practitioners community at the C-Star Science meeting in May. Yay, thank you, Jennifer and Reanna, and the whole crew. And of course, we host our Citizen Science Leader Series with lots of help and leadership from the marvelous Sarah Kirn, and that's where you are right now. Next slide. Love to hear from you. And now you're in luck because you will hear from Sophia Liu. Back on to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much, Marc, and thank you so much for what you've shared at the NASA side. Seems kind of quite relevant. I've got the Earth as our virtual background here, which is a collaboration between USGS and NASA in sharing these amazing Landsat satellite imagery. But without further ado, next slide. My name is Sophia Liu. I am the Innovation Specialist in the Science and Decision Center at the U.S. Geological Survey, or USGS. I am the coordinator in this area of work, what I'm calling participatory open science, and also co-chair of the Federal Community of Practice for Crowdsourcing Citizen Science with John McLaughlin at NOAA, who spoke earlier. So very excited to speak with you today. And next slide. I'm here in Reston, Virginia at my work office. And so what I wanted to do is first give you a little bit of background. USGS was established in 1879 as a science arm of the Department of the Interior. And our mission is to serve the nation by providing reliable scientific information to describe and understand the Earth, minimize loss of life and property from natural disasters, manage water, biological, energy, and mineral resources, and enhance and protect our quality of life. We monitor and analyze and predict current and evolving Earth system interactions and deliver actionable science at scales and timeframes relevant to decision makers. And so generally our budget, at least for 2023, is $1.7 billion, which is a little bit of an increase than our typical years, and where we employ over about 8,000 FTEs at USGS. Next. And so USGS supports what I'm generally calling participatory open science projects using various funding streams through our 5 mission areas. Historically, most of these projects are funded by the ecosystems, water resources, natural hazards, and core science systems mission areas. This funding might be provided directly through the programs in each mission area through appropriated funds, cooperative work funded through programs, centers, and regions through shared funds, funding from other agencies or partners through reimbursable funds, or project-specific funding awarded through supplemental funds. However, I would caveat that in my position, I'm not, a budget or funding analyst or have expertise in that area. So I refer to some of the resources that I provide in the chat. Next. So USGS has a long and rich history dating as far back as the 1920s, conducting participatory open science efforts using citizen science, crowdsourcing, and other kinds of community-based volunteering techniques. And here's just a sample of some of these projects that we have supported over time across our diverse mission areas, programs, and regions. These projects span topical areas like birds, aquatic species, geographic maps, earthquakes, and water. And the next. Each project engages unique populations such as indigenous communities, Twitter users, online mappers, and even youth river guides. Next, our projects also vary in purpose, such as detecting and characterizing hazards, ground truthing remote sensing imagery, validating prediction models, informing resource management decisions, identifying occurrence of species, documenting the status of water resources as just one of many ways in which we try to fill these science gaps. Next, additionally, our projects are often conducted in collaboration with academia, nonprofit organizations, and private sector companies to more effectively engage targeted members of the public and share resource needs. And next, what I'm going to do is all of these projects really vary in how they are funded at the USGS. The next slide is great. Currently, we do not have dedicated funding specifically targeted for citizen science or participatory open science projects across the USGS, like some agencies, although I think there is some value in doing this in the future. But I will discuss some of the USGS projects and how they are primarily funded internally at the USGS and competitive funding programs that we have supported these types of projects that could be available for those that are external to our agency. Next. So, for example, the USGS Did You Feel It project is supported by the USGS Earthquake Hazards Program through internally congressionally appropriated funds. This is probably our most well-known and publicized citizen seismology project that has received over 5 million Did You Feel It reports worldwide since 1999. And Did You Feel It basically collects 3 orders of magnitude more macroseismic data in the US than in the past in a cost-effective way with much fewer personnel. So since Did You Feel It is basically designed to process the data automatically, total operations, including web support, software design and upkeep, as well as user support for data requests and outreach only amounts to less than 1 FTE. In their next slide, what I mentioned is since 2009, the USGS Earthquake Hazards Program has provided on average $4 million per year and upwards of $7 million for FY23 in external grants that advance earthquake research to interested researchers. These external research grants include opportunities to improve earthquake information products and user engagement, including creative uses of citizen science or other related crowdsourcing or citizen seismology activities. Next. Another project I want to mention is the Indigenous Observation Network, or ION. It is a collaborative community-based monitoring program that began in 2005, engaging tribal community technicians to conduct permafrost and water quality monitoring in the Yukon River Basin in Alaska and Canada. ION is jointly facilitated by the USGS and an Indigenous nonprofit organization called the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council. This program is currently funded by the National Science Foundation's Navigating the New Arctic program, which covers our partner's salary, sample collection materials, and the shipping, transportation, and analysis of the samples. USGS support is provided in kind in the form of salary support for 2 USGS scientists by the Water Resources Mission Area and the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center. So in the next slide, this Science Center is part of the USGS National and Regional Climate Adaptation Science Centers, or what we often refer to in shorthand as CAS, which is a partnership-driven program that connects scientists with natural and cultural resource managers and local communities to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to the changing climate. CAS provides external grants to non-federal entities, some of which have supported participatory activities related to climate change vulnerability and adaptation, such as the Indigenous Observation Network. Next, the National Map Corps project is funded through appropriate dollars and supported under the USGS National Geospatial Program, which is one of many projects with this one specifically supporting the structures layer for the national map. So this is just one example where it's just internally supported and we don't really have external partners. In the next slide, this is just to give you more information about our USGS Community for Data Integration, or CDI program, which is an open forum for stewarding the knowledge needed for working with earth science data, the community earth science data, the National Map Corps, and many other projects have been a part of this community. It's got over 2,200 members, which includes both the USGS and external members and partners with various collaborations, including our past Citizen Science Working Group. Every year, CDI's request for proposals provides a short-term seed funding to build USGS capabilities in data integration and management, increase communication across boundaries, and create opportunities to work with people outside of our normal program, including those external to USGS. Since 2010, CDI has funded 135 competitively reviewed projects, with many of them providing the initial seed funding for various citizen science and crowdsourcing projects at the USGS. So those requesting CDI funding must be USGS employees, but these projects can provide funding to external partners. And then the next slide, which is almost my last slide, another internal competitive funding program is through the USGS Natural Hazards Mission Area. In 2018, the USGS published the Risk Research and Applications Plan that included recommendations for capacity building, case studies, and project ideas. So through the risk community of practice, competitive seed funding is provided through a bureau-wide request for proposals every year, really to foster cross-center and cross-mission area and interdisciplinary research, strengthen user engagement, and basically encourage and build the risk community of practice. Risk funding has and supported participatory open science projects that involve citizen science, stakeholder engagement, and co-production of risk products. So just like the CDI funding, the risk funding can only be requested by USGS employees, but can fund external partners. So thank you so much. Just in my last slide, thank you for the opportunity to share how the USGS supports and funds a variety of participatory open science projects across our diverse missionaries, but very happy to pass it off and finally have our last speaker. We will hear from Liam O'Fallon, health specialist with the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. So please correct me on the spelling of or pronunciation of your last name. Thank you, Liam.
Thank you very much, Sophia. Yes, it's Liam O'Fallon, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm speaking for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. In my excitement to put together this presentation, I did not necessarily ground where we are. So NIEHS, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, is one of 27 institutes and centers that is part of the larger National Institutes of Health. So I'm not talking about the whole of the National Institutes of Health, as our previous speakers have perhaps talked about the whole of the USGS and NOAA. So it is my pleasure today to talk about citizen science, community engaged research from an environmental health sciences perspective. Next slide, please. And our history really comes from an environmental justice, environmental health disparity stimulus for community engagement, dating back to a 1994 event in which community-based organizations, community leaders participated in a meeting and really emphasized the need of science as a tool for the people, research to be conducted by the community, and communicate clearly the environmental research purposes of research programs. Bottom line was that community residents wanted to be engaged in the research process, not as subjects, but as partners in the research. Next slide, please. From that, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences launched a whole series of programs and of grant programs to support work to bring researchers and communities together. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm going to focus on the 4 that are in the green boxes here: Research to Action, our Environmental Health Sciences Core Centers, a more recent Oceans and Human Health, and the Superfund Research Program. Activities within these efforts include educational efforts, opportunities to inform public health action, and answer environmental health questions that are facing the communities. Next slide, please. So first is the Research to Action, which supports community engaged research to address questions that have been identified by the community. This is a grant, and these are all grant programs. And this grant program requires an authentic community university partnership. And they have to have an action plan that is part of the proposal. As you can note, there's an open funding opportunity announcement for this, and we are working with our sister agency, the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. Next slide. Here are a couple of examples of work that's been done. So currently, right now, we have a radon project in rural Appalachia, training community residents in 4 areas. They're looking at using radon test kits and building the capacity for environmental health literacy of residents to utilize this and understand the radon exposures, and then look to see how folks can reduce their exposures to radon in their homes. Another one has been a community air monitoring network. The reason that I've talked about this one in previous settings, but the key value is that The community identified network of air monitors helped to inform state legislation AB 617 in California, because the community network of monitors was so strong and helped out in informing a lot of public health action, a school flag program, and also led to a second research to action project focused on child health related to air pollution. Next slide, please. Our Environmental Health Sciences Core Center program is, again, another grant program that is much broader, but what's interesting about the program is that it has an element in there about translating research into public health outcomes, engaging communities in multi-directional communication. All of our core centers, we support 4 of them across the US, are required to have a community engagement core to facilitate this bi-directional communication. Next slide, please. In doing that, here are a couple of examples for really understanding what's going on or building the capacity of local residents. So at the University of California at Davis, to help their to build the connection with their communities, to serve their community needs, they developed a story map, storyboard of community research priorities. And this was developed by their community stakeholder advisory committee. And so it's to help the researchers understand what the community's needs are and to help match the science with the recognized need. At the University of Pennsylvania, their Environmental Health Sciences Core Center Community Engagement Core established a series of soil workshops. And to go along with that, they created some videos and some training materials on collecting soil samples and how to do that in an appropriate way to inform and understand what the lead levels in the soil were around Philadelphia. Next slide. The Superfund Research Program is very similar to our Environmental Health Sciences Core Center, except that it focuses on hazardous substances. They too have a commitment to community engagement and must have a community engagement core. Next slide. And in that, one of the examples is it's not always going to be necessarily an environmental, exposure. Sometimes there will be more of a qualitative approach taken. And in this case, they worked with the researchers at Louisiana State University, NC State University in Tulane, worked with local community partners to map out oral histories and the recognized or the exposures, the health effects that people were feeling around the community's concerns around these open waste treatment facilities. By bringing together the expertise of modeling some of the environmental conditions as well as the oral histories, they were able to validate a connection between what was in the air contaminants and the health effects that the community residents were feeling. You can read a little bit more about that project. Next slide. Finally is our NIEHS and National Science Foundation Oceans and Human Health Initiative. And this program has been going on now for 3 iterations of the grant program. It's very innovative. And one of the elements to it is to have consistent stakeholder engagement. And most recently, there's been a larger push on the utilization of citizen science, community engaged approaches. Next slide. And one great example here is at the Bowling Green State University, where you have a harmful algal blooms monitoring effort that's taking place in the Great Lakes. They began with an Ohio Sea Grant, and the researchers at Bowling Green State University have been working with charter boat captains to collect water samples in the lakes. They built upon that, partnering with the U.S. Coast Guard for the winter season water sampling efforts. What they were seeing is there was this increased science literacy. We heard that earlier, and as well as environmental health literacy. And a lot of the participants within the U.S. Coast Guard actually went on to go and get college degrees. And then the data, they're seeing an increasing frequency and intensity of harmful algal blooms in the Great Lakes and coastlines. So you can listen to a podcast of the researcher who's been working with the citizen scientist. So these are some these are just some examples of programs that are utilizing community engaged research and citizen science approaches within grant funding by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Next slide, please. We have what we call our partnerships for environmental public health. And this is really a network of our grantees who are doing community engaged work. Through this, we try to amplify our grantee work through the development of podcasts. Next slide. Highlighting resources that the grantees are developing in partnership with their community partners and or to address community needs. Next slide. We also highlight some of the work that researchers are doing or highlighting some of the community partners. And next slide. We also have a monthly newsletter. Actually, our March newsletter just went out, but this is a way of highlighting some of the work that's going on. And through the newsletter, we also have funding opportunity announcements and other resources of interest to community engagement in environmental public health efforts. So in closing, next slide, please. If there are any other questions, comments, or questions about NIEHS and our efforts in terms of trying to support citizen science and community engagement, please feel free to reach out. Here's my contact information. Sarah, thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can actually see one another. Wow. Not only were you all incredibly articulate about what your agencies do and have given us a really clear picture, you also finished under time, which is amazing with a panel this large. I would, before we get going and start taking questions from the audience, one of you were saying right before we began, wow, this is the first time we've been together since 2019. I heard things that I didn't know about from all of you, and I wonder if any of you also heard things that are new or have a reflection or an observation after hearing from all those agencies all at the same time. So the floor is open to our panelists for reflections on what you just heard before we take questions. Anyone?
This is John. I was taking notes throughout because there were so many interesting things mentioned, but going down to my most recent note, Liam, thank you for mentioning the harmful algal blooms program with Bowling State University. The fact that that was originally funded by our Ohio Sea Grant Network was extremely interesting. So I took down the URL to listen to the podcast about it, and I'm very excited to. So that was a new joint or effort funded by two of our agencies that I was not previously aware of. So thank you.
I can just follow on John's comment that I was thinking the same thing, made a comment about the algal blooms. Clearly, there are topics and phenomena and issues, societal issues like harmful algal blooms that cut across a lot of different agencies in terms of what we each do. And I think it just made me think about how do we all share this information in a way where even though it's at the early stages or these are finished projects, you know, how do we leverage our resources like citizenscience.gov to more easily connect on these efforts rather than just through these happenstance meetings, which has been amazing. So how do we leverage each other's resources and amplify each other? So thank you.
The two takeaways that I have are the focus on environmental justice, which it cuts across most all agencies. And the other, and I think Marc said it explicitly, is that the quality of the data and how the science is done and the kind of science that results. Not only does it help people in communities, but it's also really great science if it's done well. And that's the same caveats you would have with any kind of scientific project. So really clear designs, being thoughtful about it, and then working with people to implement well. So thank you all. It's really good to be here.
Heather, did you have something? No, just, well,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I didn't have anything. Thanks.
Oh, all right. Yeah, it was so great to hear from all of you and one after another and see the differences and similarities. And one of the themes that I saw is that none of you really pigeonhole citizen science into one bucket. you're all in your funding and in your programs recognizing the multiple outcomes for citizen science, the multiple disciplines that it can contribute to. And it's just, Alison, Parker, if you're willing, I'm going to put you on the spot. It's amazing to hear the highlights that each of you shared about what is being accomplished through this research. And Alison, when you were putting together this, or part of that process of putting together the Federal Crowdsourcing and Citizen Science Act back in 2016, did you think that we would have come so far so fast?
That's a really interesting question. And I think the answer is no. Yeah, it's exciting to see how I think citizen science and, related work has entered new and different spaces, especially in the last, I think even more now than then. It's sort of been integrated into a range of work, and maybe even harder to see as it's being now shifted, especially many of you mentioned sort of open science and it being sort of integrated into that conversation. I think there's a lot of ways that we need to keep working to identify ways that, sort of to find this work in federal agencies that might not be apparent.
Yeah, and it may be maybe a positive sign that is becoming so integrated
Right.
across all of those spaces. And how do we make sure that it's still visible to those who might be looking for it or don't know that they're looking for it yet, but would be happy to find it. All right. So I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A, and I have to say, Marc, the first one up there is, can we book Marc for the Citizen Science Association conference in May? I think you're singing, you hit a note. People are excited to have more of that. Thanks for that question. And here's one specifically for the EPA. So Heather, you can take it. Do U.S. territories have the same access to all avenues as states? And I assume that's all funding avenues.
That's what I would assume too. My initial response is yes, I do believe so, but I would want to double check on that for sure and get back. So let me check on that.
All right. And there were a number of questions and requests about links. We will be sharing the recording of this event and some version of the slides that you all saw with links. Give me a hard time about that in email if you're getting impatient. I'll get to it as soon as I can. So yes, you'll get a link to the soil lead mapping project, Julie. But Liam, if you want to stick that in the chat, you can. So another question for you, Liam. Does NIEHS anticipate any new funding to support PFAS? So somebody else can help me with the actual name for PFAS, but those persistent chemicals.
Forever chemicals, yeah.
There you are. Related to citizen science efforts, for example, for sampling and analysis of PFAS in drinking wells for potentially impacted communities. This is a big deal in Maine, so I'm listening too.
Yeah. Thanks, John, for dropping in the spelling of it there in the chat box. So we have many different grant opportunities out there, and if PFAS happens to be one of the areas that is of your of interest, that is something that you can do. We do currently have a project looking at PFAS up in the eastern states, but they've also developed an interactive map, and I will drop that link into the box too. So the research to action is an active one. So if you are working with a community and that is a question of concern, and you are looking to develop a public health action plan, that might be something to look at. And I would just encourage you to look at to consider the funding opportunity announcement.
Great, thank you. So here's, since we have lots of you on, it would be fun to talk about these collaborations. So since the National Science Foundation and Environmental Protection Agency funding options are broader and more open than most of the other participant science funding sources, is there a more likely to be funded path or group to work with? And this is also related to an earlier question, which I don't know where it is. I'm taking comments and things from lots of sources right now. Anyone have a comment on that question?
So I I answered it in the Q&A, in that
Okay.
if you're talking about NSF, it's about fit. It's about matching what you want to do with a program. And then it's about looking at what's been funded before, writing a 1 or 2 page concept, contacting a program officer. I mean, we do interact with people. We really encourage you to take a look at what we fund. And then it's because because it's broad, it's also very narrow. Like what you want to do isn't going to fit 16 different places. It may fit 2 or 3. And so that's when you write up your 1 to 2 page concept and send it to a program officer. So that's from the NSF side. I think colleagues in different agencies do it different ways.
I would say the biggest opportunity at EPA right now in this very moment would be some of the environmental justice grants that I mentioned in my presentation. That's where the money is right now in our agency, and it's where we've been putting a lot of time and effort. But I agree with Ellen, take a look at what we have. Our websites are filled with information about our different grant programs and what we're looking for, and then reach out, because we do like to work with folks with ideas.
Great. And there was a theme from our event 2 weeks ago with Max Bernstein from the NASA Roses funding call, but I also heard a few of you mention it. The value to people who want to make a proposal of going in and looking at what has been funded and searching and seeing what kind of projects get funded by which different calls can really give you a new insight or new level of insight to whether your particular idea matches here or there or somewhere else. So I heard that again today. Speaking of Q&A, I was listening and focused on slides. Did anyone answer or ask a question or answer a question that was particularly interesting that you want to make sure everyone heard the answer to? Other hot questions in the Q&A? All right, let's take a live question. Margaret Gordo, you've got your hand up and you've had it up for a while patiently. Do you have a question for our panel?
Hi, Sarah. I'm just going to chime in and say that's Ms. Margaret Gordon. Ms. Margaret,
I'm not.
do you have a question?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, there you go. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Ms. Margaret Gordon, and I'm really surprised. I'm very surprised that no one talked about in this conversation about those communities who don't have amenities for sewage, air, water, and soil, and how these resources and organizations don't have a list of those communities who still live on the 19th century type amenities for sewage, or just lack of having filtration or just water accessibility, such as Sand Branch and outside Dallas, Texas. Freedom is a Freedom community outside Miami, whereas that they still have these structural amenities that are not applied to them as citizens of the United States. I would like to see that type of interaction, project development, citizen science, program development for those who own this panel. At least have the conversation.
Thank you for that question. And you raise a really important issue, and thinking about the funding agencies, the topic of this conversation, it does occur to me that maybe the opportunities that our panelists today are providing, or the opportunities that federal agencies are providing, may not be accessible to those communities you're talking about. There may need to be a little bit more in terms of outreach and support for those
Not
communities and
outreach,
taking advantage.
intentionality.
Is that?
We need intent. No, it needs to be intentional.
Yeah.
Being intentional to tell the local government these people have a right to have these amenities as the other citizens that is in those communities. I would like to hear more about that, because that is, we should not be in 2023, people who don't have access to clean water or access to sewage. That's very criminal.
Ms. Margaret Gordon.
I couldn't agree more.
Sarah and Miss Margaret Gordon, I'm going to pull up a couple of projects and I'll be back on in just a second, okay? That relate to what Margaret Gordon was talking about, because yes, and to Sarah's point, some communities have a hard time directly applying to the government for work like this. However, in partnership, we do fund work like this. So give me a couple minutes and I'll pull up a couple of things.
Well, thank you very much. But I would like to, for citizen science, we should have had a better understanding for those communities, those citizens, those neighborhoods who don't have those amenities for citizen science.
Here. And I think all of us would agree with you that those shouldn't be considered amenities. Those are essential human services that everyone deserves. So we'll get them.
I didn't hear that conversation. That conversation was not mixed in for each presenter, how they were being supportive of that.
I think just as a follow-up comment to that is, you know, as I think John was mentioning, there's a growing interest, and I'm sorry, maybe I got it wrong, but around environmental justice. If with this administration, we've seen more efforts around that tie-in. Even the Citizen Science Association had a big push towards that type of theme in that connection to citizen science. And with a lot of the recent legislation through this administration around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, as well as other efforts towards environmental and broader health concerns and issues, that has, I think, provided some support for across the federal government to work towards that direction. I am also just kind of channeling a colleague of mine at USGS who does more stakeholder engagement efforts and others that work with tribal communities, where I think we in the federal government are trying to work towards, although it may not always be a practice, to have our science be informed by maybe socioeconomic related information and data. Just as your point, you know, understanding where communities that do require or need some assistance or whatever the issue might be, and how can that inform and drive the work that we do. And so I think that we increasingly, I think, are moving towards resources that to help us do that on the federal side, but I do think that is an important need in connecting from the environmental health, environmental justice side of issues and other communities to work on this together.
Ms. Margaret, thank you very much for your question and holding us accountable, keeping, you know, making sure that, you know, this topic is important. You've continued to challenge me, I know, over the years, so thank you. I know that within the NIEHS, there's a new program, the Compass program, that has come out looking at issues of really community-led efforts and support through that. I'll be happy to drop in the link there. And there is a current effort looking at you know, systemic racism and its contributions to disproportionate health outcomes, and I'll make sure to find that as well. But I do think that you're right. It is an important conversation to have in terms of people who are at the front line, who have been historically under-resourced and disadvantaged through systems and the ways in which we can work together to collect the data to help show the health impacts and the disproportionate exposures through that is absolutely vital and relevant to community engaged research and citizen science. So thanks again for bringing that up. You're right, we did not talk about that explicitly.
This is
Great.
should not only be about feeling good. Citizen science also should be about how to alleviate those who are still in harm's way. I'm just really shocked. I was really shocked to hear those presenters who didn't see that there's still a segment of the population do not have certain amenities. And that presentation still did not even address those who do not still don't have.
Yeah, I echo the thanks for raising this essential issue. And in addition to the lack of resources that you mentioned, which are critical and essential for life, we at NOAA also recognize that a lot of the communities that are under-resourced have much greater exposure to extreme weather and climate change impacts that our agency works on. And I had mentioned the environmental literacy program and presented the theory of change, and funding opportunities for this program are focusing especially on reaching underserved members of the community who are systematically denied a full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civic life. So we have a long way to go, but we are trying to improve our services offered to these communities because it's essential. We do.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Margaret. You've raised a really important issue and you've gotten a lot of attention. Ellen's going to put, I think, some resources in the chat, but you've gotten everyone on this call's attention, and I really appreciate you coming forward. I'd like to give a chance to somebody else to ask a question. Shervin Hess, do you want to pose a question to our panel?
Yeah, thank you. And it's not to take away from the urgency, but it's sort of related, but obviously not as urgent. My question was about if anybody on the panel knows of grants that specifically prioritize outdoor equity and nature connection in addition to, you know, the quality of the data collected.
Ellen.
I just put I just put the ASL program, the Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program. It's one of the ones I work on at the National Science Foundation. It is one, we focus primarily on learning outside of schools, knowledge generation with an equity lens. You have to have an equity lens. And so I'm running panels on those topics right now.
Great, thank you. And then beyond that, if there are ones that are specifically about not just getting citizens out to collect data, but with an equal emphasis put on for anybody having that connection with nature, is there anything with that? I know you mentioned this one specifically on equity, so it's kind of two separate questions.
The ASL program does both, but my other colleagues have others. So yeah. So, but the ASL program is one that you should look at. I'll make sure the link's in the chat, but I want to give my other colleagues who may have all other opportunities a chance.
Great, thank you.
Anyone else?
This is John.
Yeah.
I'm putting the name and link to this program in the chat, but it was also hyperlinked to my presentation. That's the Bay Watershed Education and Training Program, which is a funding program we offer to get meaningful watershed education experiences for students. And that is defined as getting their hands or feet wet or doing something hands-on and experiential. So basically connecting students with nature. So I'll put that funding program name and linkage in the chat for you to investigate further.
Great, thank you. So we are almost at the end of our formal time together here. So we just have a couple small announcements, and then we'll continue our Q&A with everyone who can stay with us. Reanna, I think you want to remind us about a few things.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. We just wanted to give folks another, especially for anyone that joined us late, a reminder about our conference coming up in May. Registration is going to open up next week for our Seaside 2023 conference. For those of you on the call that are a part of the NASA SitSide Leaders community, if you haven't already RSVP'd for that May 22nd event, please do so. check for some messages on that. We're looking forward to connecting with the NASA leaders community and the broader citizen science community in person again, as well as virtually. We will have virtual components to our Seaside 2023 event. And so if you're unable to join us in Tempe, do check out the opportunities to share and learn online through the online posters and some live sessions.
Great, thank you. And you can stop the recording if you like, and we'll continue with our conversations, other questions. And if any of you panelists have seen questions that have flown by that I missed, please also bring them forward.